Welcome to The Difference Engine, the show for tech founders, investors, and innovators. Today's IT industry owes a lot to other areas of human activity. Inspired by the punch cards that control Jacquard textile looms, the father of the computer, mathematician Charles Babbage, worked on the basics of the difference engine, after which this podcast is named. And he did it without electricity. Using that power source eventually, the HP company's first products were for the Disney movie Fantasia, and the AI chips we use today as enterprise IT were originally used to power video games. So it's perhaps no surprise that the world of entertainment and IT cross-pollinate so beautifully. Today's guest is living proof of the link between mathematics, music, and electronics.
David Friend is the man who founded ARP. He sold newfangled synthesizers to notable locals including David Bowie, George Harrison, Jimmy Page, and Pete Townsend. ARP even provided the legendary 5-note communication in Close Encounters of the Third Kind and the Star Wars droid R2-D2's voice. David's music industry days are now behind him, but that does not mean this 5-time founder is taking it easy. Oh no. Today, he proudly sits atop and orchestrates Wasabi, the 4th largest data storage company in the world, outscored, or perhaps outstored, only by Amazon, Microsoft, and Google. David Friend, welcome to The Difference Engine.
So, David, can you take us back to your younger days at Yale, where all of this story started?
Sure. Well, I was a double major in music and engineering. I went to college during the Vietnam War, and nobody was really thinking about careers at that time. When you got out of college in 1969, like I did, your choices were Vietnam, Canada, or jail.
I'll take Canada, please.
So, but I had would love to have been a professional musician, but I didn't have the talent. But I kept my engineering work going, and I had always been a science nerd as a kid and building electronics projects in the basement. But I ended up with a bursary job that paid for my gas, and I built the electronic music studio at Yale. So I was designing equipment that the composers were using and that I was using myself for my own sort of avant-garde electronic music. And this, eventually led to the founding of the synthesizer company ARP that became such a big deal in the 1970s and are still being sold today in music stores around the world.
The early ARPs were not particularly portable machines. They were big and chunky and expensive. But even then, the music industry got to hear about what you were doing and beat a path to your door. And some names that some of our listeners would be very familiar with went and found David Friend. Can you tell us a little bit about that?
Back in the early days of synthesizers, and when we entered the market in 1970, another company called Moog had already been in the market, and these things were basically used to create avant-garde music. And in fact, my first customer, when we were 5 engineers sitting around building the first synthesizer, and we get the first one built, and then we all looked at each other and says, "Who's going to sell it?" And yeah. I was the least unpresentable of the 5, so I was elected to do that. And of course, I went back to Yale, and Yale turned out to be, I think our first or second customer. After a year or so, rock bands with a lot of resources like The Who and Led Zeppelin and so forth started to appear. And they started using our synthesizers on their recordings. And I remember one of the first things I did to market ARP was take this big 30,000-pound synthesizer. I brought it to the Audio Engineering Society meeting in New York City, and turn around, and there's George Harrison looking over my shoulder asking, "What the heck is this thing and how do you use it?" That proceeded for a year or so until studios and rock bands became actually a bigger part of our business than university electronic music studios. And that's when I had the sort of the insight where I said, if we could make these things cheap enough and simple enough, they could be sold through retail music stores, and every high school rock band would go out and buy them. And that led to the development of the ARP 2600, which was probably the first major synthesizer designed specifically for stage use.
There was you and the Mini Moog, really, out there on stage, and just about every famous artist you could possibly name started using you or the Moog or both, and music changed forever. And we had the evolution of the German electronic bands and disco and funk and progressive rock. Everybody was using your machine, so you'd sort of hit gold by that time.
Yeah, and it changed my life because I quickly morphed from being an engineer to being basically a sales guy, which is what a CEO does. You sell your customers, you sell your employees, you sell your investors. And my days during the 1970s largely consisted of going to some recording studio and waiting for some band to show up so I could put an endorsement contract in front of them before the manager showed up. During the 70s, there was a lot of drugs and money in the rock and roll business, and frequently the band would show up and they'd be too stoned to even see where the signature line was on the contract, or they wouldn't show up at all. I'd get up at 3 p.m, head off to some recording studio in New York City, wait for the band to come in. They'd stagger in at 2 a.m. or something like that. And so but we had over 100 major bands as official ARP endorsees by about 1974.
I was counting my CD collection the other day and just trying to work out which of the CDs had ARP technology on it, and there was definitely more that had it than didn't. Probably says a lot about my musical taste, but certainly you've influenced a whole generation, and it's true that even today the ARP sound is available on the current generation of synthesizers.
Yeah, Korg modules, right?
Yeah, well, Korg came to me, I don't know, 6 or 7 years ago, maybe a little more, 10 years ago, and said that there was demand for these old ARP synthesizers in the market, that everybody wanted that old analog synthesizer sound.
Yeah, nice.
And they wanted to re-release all these old ARPs, and they asked me if I would consult on that project to help them with some of the technical details. And, they've re-released the 2600 and the ARP Odyssey, and they're selling better today than they did in the 70s.
How validating, man. That's just brilliant. I love it. It's like you've created like the Les Paul of synthesizers there, David. You've described yourself, and I love this because Jono and I started all I spent a lot of time in PR. So you describe yourself as a one-man publicity machine, which again is part of your role as a conductor, an orchestrator of several companies at this point. And you mentioned how you, sort of just getting featured in magazines and the endorsements really helped.
Getting yourself known is always the biggest problem. And I would write columns for magazines in the music industry. There was a magazine called Keyboard. I don't know if it still exists, but it was a magazine dedicated to keyboard players. And I raised my hand and said, how'd you like to have a monthly column on synthesizers? And then, you just show up places where people who influence the music industry are going to be. And so it was hard on my family because you're away a lot. You spend your days hanging out at a recording session or something of that nature. But you do what you have to do. And I don't view it as pulling the wool over anybody's eyes. I mean, the thing that always got me going and still gets me going is the fact that I really love the idea of being a composer, and starting a company is like you take a blank sheet of paper, you start filling in the notes, and after a while you have a composition. And I get that same sense of satisfaction from starting companies. And Wasabi, see on my shirt here, is number 6. for me since getting out of college.
One of the things, you talk about orchestration and, you being the least, I love that, the least unpresentable one of the crew. So you basically ended up running the firm, this one-man publicity machine, getting that stuff sold. And there came a point where you thought, maybe we should get some external investment in this.
Well, the challenge in ARP was, finding bands to endorse your products before they got so famous that, you couldn't afford to get their endorsements anymore. And so, I would sit there poring over record sales and airplay statistics and things like that. And when the Apple II computer came along, I taught myself how to program, and I designed a program for the Apple II computer called TrendSpotter. And basically, I had my assistant fill in all this data, and then it allowed me to use data visualization to figure out, who was likely to be, the next band that people were going to be listening to. And one day I had a venture capitalist in my office to try to raise some money for ARP. And he wasn't interested in that, but he was very interested in this piece of software that I had developed for the Apple II computer, because at that time there weren't very many CEOs around who had a PC on their desk. And I showed him what I could do. I showed him how I could compare record sales for, 100 top bands in California versus 100 top bands in New York City, and that sort of thing. And he said, look, why don't you get out of the synthesizer business, and I'll give you $1 million to seed a company to commercialize that software. And, I dismissed it at first, but the long story short is 6 months later, we sold ARP to CBS Musical Instruments, and I launched a company called Computer Pictures with that guy's $1 million.
Well, I have to say, that is what VCs, historically, allegedly think that they do. Like, they see something that other people don't. You don't hear stories like that very often. You don't hear them much anymore, I have to say.
So that was the beginning of my software career. I've been there ever since, and thankful for it, in fact, because the music industry was fun when I was in my 20s, but I certainly wouldn't want to be doing it today.
So there you were. Data visualization became your thing, and that was the new thread in your career. And can you talk us through the next couple of companies that were essentially based on this expertise in data visualization?
The first company, Computer Pictures, got bought by a larger software company less than 2 years after we founded it. And that was the first time we were able to put some money in our pockets. And then we, and I mean me and my longtime technical genius co-founder, Jeff Flowers, we founded a company called Pilot Software, which developed the same basic kind of software, but designed for larger companies with much larger data sets. So that company sold to Burger King and JCPenney and big chains of department stores, and mostly companies that had multiple outlets where they were trying to use data visualization to figure out which stores were underperforming and why they were underperforming. And that company was very successful. It grew, and then we sold it about 8 or 9 years later to Dun & Bradstreet.
They use it to crunch their AC Nielsen data. I mean, it was a very interesting acquisition. They had a particular application they wanted to use it for.
Exactly. So, the same thing where they have, hundreds of or thousands of television outlets around the country all doing advertising. And that was the third company. Yep.
At this point, the music's almost a distant memory. You're pretty much all in on data. And a couple of the threads there, like a technical co-founder, this is all the classic advice that people get when they start up these days. But I guess you're just doing it on the fly. You were like into data super early, before anybody else, right? Before everyone else woke up to it.
Well, as a CEO, you realize very quickly how much your business depends on having data. And, so I got, when I was running ARP, I just got very frustrated with, having to sit there with pages of paper and, trying to take numbers off of a magazine and put them on a graph paper or something like that. I mean, it was just unbelievably tedious. That's what sort of led me to develop this software myself. When I saw this Apple computer, I said, wow, this has got graphics capability. This is just what I need.
But you also moved it onto the PC because you'd realized that the PC was going to be the The corporate standard, I guess, by that time.
And then I also realized, back in 1980, well, I forget what it was now, the date, but we were Pilot software was one of the very first so-called client server applications where the data resided on a mainframe, but all of the presentation of the data was done on a PC that was talking to the mainframe. So, at that time, people had mainframes and they had dumb terminals. And, we unplugged the dumb terminal and plugged in the PC and said, now we can do a lot more at the desktop.
You've never been afraid of getting out there on the road, and we saw that in ARP, but you were doing it with pilots as well. And you used to basically ask the prospects to give you a chunk of their data under NDA, and then you'd show them what you could do with it.
Frequently, people were very surprised with what they would see in their own data. So if we were going to go out and do a sales pitch, we'd ask the company to give us, a sample data set that we could then look at. We were actually at the offices of Alitalia, the Italian airline, and we had all the senior execs in the conference room, including the CEO. And I get started with my presentation and putting up, showing how Alitalia's performance was going in various markets and cost structures and things like that. And the executives start arguing among them, pointing at the screen and arguing among themselves about the data in Italian, which I didn't understand. And the argument got more and more heated with more and more gesticulation. And finally, they all get up from the table and they march out of the room yelling at each other, going down the corridor. I could hear them, the yelling disappearing into the end. And we're sitting there in the conference room all by ourselves.
Wow.
Finally, we just packed up and left.
Wow.
Perhaps it was better in the end that you did give that company away to Dun & Bradstreet. But we often wonder when we're talking to great serial entrepreneurs like yourself, where do you get your ideas from? And I think your next company came from an insight you got by having a daughter who perhaps wasn't doing what she should have been doing with her computer.
Well, this was the early days of the internet. And at that time, everybody had laptops and PCs, and they were typically backing them up, if they did back them up at all. They were typically backing them up by buying backup software like Symantec or others, McAfee, and backing them up to an external hard drive. And, the truth of the matter is, that's what I did, but, I didn't do it every day. In fact, I didn't do it very often at all. Neither did my daughter, apparently. She was in college in New York, and she calls me up one day and says, "Dad, the hard drive in my computer crashed, and I have a term paper that I've been working on all semester, and it's due on Friday." So I get in the car, I drive down to New York City, we take the hard drive out, bring it over to one of these labs that supposedly can recover data from dead hard drives, and they charged me $1,300, and they couldn't get the data back. And then, so I get back to Boston, and I'm having lunch with my founder partner, Jeff Flowers, and he said, somebody just broke into my wife's car and stole her laptop, and she lost 2 years of baby pictures that she hadn't backed up. And then we sat there and looked at each other and just says, everybody's sitting here connected to the internet. Why can't this, everything you're doing on your PC just sort of float up to the cloud in the background without having to do anything? When you're connected to the internet, it's just working in the background. You never have to think about it again until something happens to your computer. And that was the beginning of Carbonite, which became the largest endpoint backup product in the US. And it was the first backup product to integrate the data storage with the software on the PC. So we had to build enough storage in the background to back up 2 million or 3 million PCs every night. So it was a massive amount of data, and we had a big data center, where we stored all these backups, all this information.
The weird thing about that is that so often in innovation, the thing which stimulates more innovation isn't the thing you would think it was. So you came up with this great application, you had a big total addressable market. There was a clear problem to be solved. But you're tinkering in the background on storage.
Yeah, so we got very good at storage because the consumer market is very competitive and you always have to be, low cost and high performance. You don't want your phone ringing with customer calls and customer complaints, because when you're only charging, $50 a year or something like that for a subscription, one phone call to customer support eats up the entire profit from that customer. One day, Jeff comes to me while I was still CEO of Carbonite, and he said he and our chief architect had an idea for a new storage architecture that, if they could make it work, would be much cheaper and much higher performance than what Amazon and Microsoft and Google had introduced with their cloud services. So I said, yeah, go see if you can make it work. And they basically camped out at Jeff's house north of Boston in Marblehead for a year. And finally, they came back and said, it's working. We've got it working, and we think this can scale up to exabytes. And I looked at the numbers and I said, holy cow, Jeff, we could sell cloud storage that's a quarter of the price of Amazon's, and it's faster, and we can still make good margins. And when I thought of that, and then I thought about how big is the storage market, what's the potential for this? I just said, whoa. And so I recruited a new CEO for Carbonite and left to found Wasabi with Jeff.
Well, that's so interesting because, we've skipped across there seamlessly because you're just looking at the numbers. 3 alleged categories. You got the backup category. That was a thing. Then you got the online storage, and now we're talking about cloud storage. It's as if the ideas that you have float across existing categories, and I guess that's sort of the way your mind works, right?
One thing leads to another, but it's also, I still always, if you look at sort of what I do as opposed to necessarily what I say, what I do is I'm always looking for that blank sheet of paper where I can start filling in the notes. And I'm good as a CEO at this point in my career. I've made all the mistakes, and everything looks familiar to me now. But what I still love, what still gets me excited and cranked up, is something new. Putting together, here's this technology over here. Here's a user need over here. Let's put the two things together and create a market. And, so that's kind of what gets me going.
So here you are, you're in 4th place in terms of the amount of data storage providers behind the obvious big 3. But you've come into the market at a time when the nature of what is being stored and why it's being stored has changed. And can you talk us through that and how that has affected how you think about what it is you provide?
What's happened in the last couple of years is AI has reared its head as one of the biggest, if not the biggest, consumer of storage.
We've noticed.
Yeah, really. And because when we started, most of the data that people were sending us were backups. So, it was that sort of logical step from Carbonite, my old company. And then, kind of out of the blue, a couple of years ago, people started showing up with data lakes. And we'd ask them, well, what is all this data? Well, this is 14 million hours of video that we're using to train an AI to, recognize cars or logos or whatever, And then, so that's kind of like taken over a big part of our business. And what we realized pretty quickly was that the AI industry requires some different kinds of storage from what we were offering. We love this idea of a sort of a one-size-fits-all storage, which is what we had been marketing up to last year. But we recognized that there was a need for faster storage that was more expensive, and also slower storage that was much cheaper. So we introduced, late last year, we introduced our first all-flash-based storage region in San Jose, aimed specifically at the AI industry. And it works exactly the same as our our regular Wasabi storage, but it's much, much faster.
Is that because of the difference between training and inference stages of the AI?
Yes, exactly. Because and also as a cache for when you're doing training. So if you're going to train a model, you move a chunk of data out of a slower tier of storage into faster storage because you don't want those expensive NVIDIA chips sitting idle while they're waiting for data to be read out of memory. So it's both those use cases. But then there's also, okay, I've got all this old data. A lot of it is 10 years old, but I still might need it again to train a model. We need to put that somewhere. It's, the cheapest kind of storage, safe, but the
I
cheapest.
want it, but not right away.
I'm not willing to pay to keep it, milliseconds away from in a response standpoint. So you'll be seeing from Wasabi fairly soon announcement of a new tier of storage, which will be much less expensive and competing with Amazon Glacier.
The people you play with always seem to change, right? So you were obviously dealing with the guys rolling at 2:00 in the morning, maybe with leather trousers, and now you've got Jensen and his leather jacket that you need to play nice with. It must be fascinating, all of these different types of folks that you constantly have to, I guess the industry term for it is partner with these days. We
have hundreds of partnerships, and partnerships are where it's at in our business because, I'm not able to predict who the winners are going to be in the AI industry, but we're selling the picks and shovels to the industry. No matter what you're doing with AI, you still need data. And people say, well, isn't that a boring business to be in, storage? And I'm like, yeah, I love boring.
I love it.
Because it's predictable, it's a real business, and I don't care who wins in the AI industry. If I can sell storage to all of them, what difference does it make to me? And so at this stage in my career, I'm very happy to be at that foundational level, selling to everybody who's really trying to figure it out at the top end. We're not going to be developing, the next Chat GPT.
Yeah, but then you didn't write the music. You gave the guys the instruments. So there's a massive read across here.
Exactly.
And you said to us at the start here that you think of yourself as an orchestra conductor, which I find amazing. Could you, like, a lot of people who listen to this pod are trying to, create that number one hit. They're trying to create the next application. What lessons can you give for tomorrow's category builders, based off, your amazing career so far?
Being a CEO is, it doesn't require that you need to do everybody's jobs. And you have to think about, as a CEO, what is it that you uniquely can do, and focus on that, because, unless everybody is adding their own unique skills to the picture, you're not going to be successful. And I see a lot of young CEOs who are kind of micromanagers, and, they want to write the code, they want to design the marketing, they want to do this, they want to do that. And you have to be ready to delegate. And, at this point, I'm perfectly happy to delegate everything I can possibly delegate, which leaves me as the spokesperson for the company. It leaves me as the person who sets sort of company culture. And those things may not sound like a lot of work. And there's certainly a lot less work than going out and doing sales calls all day long. But you're like an orchestra conductor, because you don't have to be the best violinist. You don't have to know how to play the bassoon. You don't have to play the harp or the tuba or anything else. Your job is to make it all function together, and to make sure engineering is building the products that the customers want, and that the marketing people understand the message that they need to transmit to the customer. So you can spend your time putting yourself in the shoes of the person who's going to be buying your product and say, why the heck would I want to buy this product?
I love that. Yeah.
The one lesson you learn in business is nobody cares whether you're successful or not. So it's up to you to make it happen.
Just to extend this analogy a little bit more, David, the conductor and composer relationship. Now, if you're the conductor, then your longtime collaborator, Jeff, is sort of the composer. And clearly your relationship has been absolutely vital. Can you talk a little bit about, you mentioned earlier Jeff had been away and started to develop a new storage architecture. How does it work between you and him? I mean, there's a great phrase, build it and they will come. And often in tech, you can build something very, very, apparently brilliant, but nobody will buy it because it doesn't have the market characteristics it should have. Can you talk us about the dynamic between you two, sort of who comes up with the ideas, who shapes them, and does that vary?
It's an interactive process with Jeff and me, and it usually starts sitting over a cup of coffee in his dining room, or going out to lunch and just shooting the shit, and thinking about what's going on in the industry. And we always seem to have a long list of ideas that someday, if we get around to it, we'll explore. But I think the Jeff is phenomenal at seeing kind of where technology is going and proposing a whole bunch of ways that might benefit customers that customers aren't doing yet. And I think where I come in is I'm kind of the guy that says I can't see anybody buying that, or wow, if we could actually do that, I could see a lot of people buying that. One of the jobs of a CEO is selling people. And when young people ask me, what should I do to get ready for a business career? I say, learn how to sell, learn how to carry a bag, because you got to sell investors on your dream. You have to sell employees on leaving their well-paying jobs to come to work for a startup with no resources. You have to sell customers on the idea that it's safe to buy a product from a company with 5 employees and no resources,
And of course, partners, right? These days, partner.
Partners. And so, you're always selling, and you can do it well if you're excited about what you're actually doing. It doesn't come off as salesmanship. It comes off as a sincere belief that what you're doing is beneficial to the customer.
The name Wasabi, it fascinates me, and I know you could tell us a little story about how that came about.
Company names are really important, and it always amazes me how so many company names in the tech industry are either impossible to pronounce or impossible to spell if you hear them. Why should you make somebody have to sit around and search on the web for 15 minutes trying to find the name of the company that you just heard because the name has got some weird spelling? So we had a list of like 200 possible names that we were considering. My CMO, Mike Welch. And when we saw Wasabi, we said, wow, that's a word. If you hear it, you can spell it. If you see it, you can pronounce it. It doesn't mean something obscene in some foreign language. And nobody's using the URL. So it checked all the boxes for me. And we're selling hot storage. And, obviously anybody who's had a mouthful of wasabi knows what that means. So unfortunately, the name was owned by one of these website brokers. And it was a UK company, actually, you guys will appreciate. And he wanted $500,000 for the URL. And at that time, we only had $2 million to our name. And so we did a trick that I learned at Carbonite, which was a similar situation. We went out and we bought wasabi.de, wasabi.it, wasabi.es, wasabi.jp, and so forth. And then a few months, and we paid like $10 for each of those. And then we went back to the guy and we said, look, anybody who's going to spend $500,000 on a .com is going to want .it, .de, .sb, etc. And guess what? We own them all. And so we were able to talk the guy down substantially and acquire the wasabi.com name. The only one we couldn't get was wasabi.co.uk, because I'm sure you guys have seen that chain of low-end sushi bars that are in Paddington Station, and we couldn't get that one. But every week we do get a few emails from customers complaining about the service, or the tuna was smelly.
Thank you for listening. If you want to learn more about category design, head to becategorical.com. If you need help designing and dominating your category, then get in touch. Contact details are in the show notes.